The glass hit the floor before Selim could breathe. 1 second the tray was level. The next, champagne exploding upward in slow gold arcs, crystal fracturing against marble. The sharp crack cutting clean through the piano music like a blade through silk. Every head in that ballroom turned. 300 people. All of them alpha. All of them dressed in the kind of money that doesn't announce itself. And every single pair of eyes landed on the same place. On him. Selim stood in the wreckage. Chest tight. Hands shaking at his sides. Fingers still curled around nothing. The broken stems glittered at his feet like shattered teeth. He did not move. He could not speak. And in a room full of people who fed on weakness the way sharks fed on blood, that stillness was the loudest thing in the space. The laughter started low. Then it spread. Look at that. A man in a charcoal suit leaned toward his companion, not even bothering to lower his voice. Gold cufflinks. Wide jaw. The kind of smirk that had never once been corrected. They actually sent a mute to serve tonight. His companion chuckled. Can't even apologize for the mess. Selim did not look up. His jaw was tight. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, not from shame, though they wanted to believe that. It was calculation. It was survival. He had learned, over years that left marks invisible to the naked eye, that looking up only gave them a target. A server rushed over with a cloth. Young. Nervous. She crouched beside the glass without a word, cleaning quickly, not making eye contact with Selim or anyone else. That was the training. Move fast. Stay small. Disappear. Selim reached down to help. Don't. The voice came from 2 feet away. Sharp. Flat. Like a door slamming. He looked up. The alpha standing over him was broad-shouldered, mid-30s, with the kind of stillness that came from never being challenged. Dark eyes dropped to Selim's face with the lazy assessment of someone reading a menu. Unimpressed. Certain. He had a champagne flute still in his hand, nearly full, and he held it out now, not toward the clean table. Toward Selim. Pick this up when you're done on your knees. The room did not go quiet. That was the part that stayed with Selim later. The room did not go quiet, because what was happening was not unusual enough to pause conversation. A few people glanced over. A woman in a red gown smiled, the polite kind that meant nothing. The piano kept playing. Someone across the hall laughed at something entirely unrelated. This was background noise. He was background noise. Selim took the flute. He straightened. He did not look at the man's face. Hi viewers, have you ever been in a room full of people and realized, in one single moment, that not a single person there actually saw you? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I want to know. The alpha with the cufflinks drifted closer now, circling with the unhurried patience of someone who had nowhere to be and nothing to lose. Mute Omega at a mafia wedding. He glanced at his friends. Who thought that was a good idea? More laughter. Easy. Reflexive. Selim's hand stayed level. The flute did not shake. He turned toward the nearest table to set it down, and a hand came from his left, catching his wrist. Not hard. Not rough. Just enough. Just enough to stop him. I'm not done with you. The alpha who gripped him was younger than the first. Early 20s. Gold rings on every other finger. He leaned in close enough that Selim could smell the whiskey on his breath. Say something. Come on. Just one word. Silence. The young alpha's eyes narrowed, then brightened, the way a child's eyes brighten when they find something they can break. Can't or won't. What hurt most wasn't the insult. It was how normal it felt to everyone else. The grip tightened. Selim felt the pressure travel up his forearm, felt the heat of it, felt the sharp edge of one of those gold rings pressing against his skin. He did not pull away. He had learned a long time ago that pulling away gave them the reaction they were hunting for. It confirmed the story they were already telling themselves, that he was fragile. that he was theirs to push. He stayed still. And then, from across the room, nothing moved. No one stepped forward. No voice rose above the ambient noise. But something changed. It was the kind of change you feel before you see it. Like the air before a storm shifts. Not dramatically, not with thunder. Just a quiet, almost imperceptible drop in temperature. Pressure adjustment. Something that made the hairs on the back of the neck stand up without knowing why. Selim did not feel it then. He was too focused on keeping his breathing even, on keeping his face neutral, on surviving the next 30 seconds with his dignity still attached somewhere inside his chest. But three men standing at the far edge of the ballroom, near the tall arched windows, dressed in identical black, motionless in a room that never stopped moving, those three men felt it. Because they caused it. They had been watching since the tray hit the floor. Not with amusement. Not with irritation. With something quieter than both. Something measured. The kind of attention that doesn't announce itself. The kind that stays. The young alpha with the gold rings finally released Selim's wrist. Not because he chose to. Not because anyone intervened. He released it because his friend called his name from across the room, and the moment, like all small cruelties, moved on. Selim set the flute down, turned, walked toward the service corridor. His shoes made no sound on the marble. His shoulders were straight. His face gave away nothing. And in the space he left behind, that arched window corner of the ballroom, one of the three men shifted his weight slightly, turned to the man standing to his left, said nothing out loud, but his jaw tightened, and his eyes did not leave the door Selim had walked through. He found a breath in the corridor. Just one. Short. Controlled. The kind that didn't look like relief because he couldn't afford for it to look like relief. The service hallway ran along the back of the ballroom like a spine, narrow, fluorescent, smelling of warming trays and old carpet. Three other servers moved through it in quick orbits, eyes down, trays balanced, each one carrying that particular tension of people who know they are one mistake away from something worse. Selim pressed his back against the wall for 4 seconds, counted them, then pushed off and reached for a new tray. Inside his head, it was never quiet. That was something people never understood about silence. The assumption that it meant emptiness. That if you couldn't speak, you also couldn't think. Couldn't feel. Couldn't hear every word they said about you with perfect, crystalline clarity. He heard everything. Every word the alpha with the gold rings had said. Every laugh from the crowd. Every note in the piano that kept playing while a man gripped his wrist and waited for him to flinch. He kept it all, filed it away in the place inside his chest where things went when there was nowhere else to put them. That place was getting full. He re-entered the ballroom from the east corridor, tray level, pace even. The reception had settled back into its rhythm. Toasts being made near the front, a cluster of suited men arguing quietly near the bar, the bride in ivory standing beside her new husband with the expression of someone who had already done the math and found it acceptable. This was a wedding, technically, a union of two crime families, practically, and the guests, all alpha, all dangerous in the way that money and violence made men dangerous, were celebrating the way powerful people celebrated. Not with joy, with confirmation. This was a room full of people reminding each other what they were worth. Selim moved through it like water around stone. You! A finger snapped to his left. He turned. Older man. Silver temples. A woman on his arm who looked through Selim the way you look through a window. The alpha gestured at his empty glass without looking up from the conversation he was having with the man beside him. Selim filled it. Not that one. The man finally glanced at the bottle. That's the cheap pour. Get the Bollinger. There was no cheap pour. The tray held only one type of champagne, the same served to everyone. Selim held the bottle so the man could see the label. The alpha stared at it. Then at Selim. Then made a sound in his throat. Dismissive, impatient, and turned back to his conversation as if Selim had made an error by being correct. The woman on his arm smiled. Not at Selim. At nothing in particular. The polite, automatic smile of someone trained to fill silences that didn't need filling. Selim moved on. 2 tables later, a group of younger alphas had arranged themselves with the specific posture of people who were bored and looking for something to make them less bored. 3 of them. Loud. Sharp-eyed. The kind of young that hadn't learned yet to hide what they were. One of them stuck his foot out. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough. Just across the path Selim needed to walk. Selim saw it. Slowed. Stepped around it. The alpha pulled his foot back and exchanged a look with the man beside him. A quick flash of disappointment. The way children look when a trap doesn't spring. Then the second one reached out and pushed the base of Selim's tray. Not hard, just a tap. Enough to make the flutes tremble. Enough to make Selim's body lock up fast to compensate. Careful, the first one said, with the voice of someone who was not concerned at all. You don't want to drop something again. Laughter. Easy. Practiced. The kind that had a particular shape, circular, self-reinforcing. Selim straightened the tray. Said nothing. Moved on. He could feel the back of his neck. That particular heat that settled there when too many eyes were on him at once. He had felt it for most of his life. The sensation of being watched by people who were deciding what you were worth and landing consistently on the same answer. Not enough. Never enough. He rounded the far side of the room, approaching a quiet stretch near the windows. The tall, arched windows that faced the garden. He kept his eyes ahead and then stopped. Not because anyone told him to, because the air was different here. He couldn't have explained it if someone had asked. It was a pressure, just slight, the way a room feels different when someone turns to look at you before you turn to look at them. Like the attention was already there, already settled, and you had walked into the middle of it without knowing. He kept walking, but something registered. Something at the edge of his awareness that he couldn't name yet. 3 men, standing near the window. Still. Quiet. Not talking to anyone. Not drinking. Not performing the social theater that was the entire point of being in this room. Just watching. He didn't look at them directly. He had learned early that looking directly at alphas who weren't talking to you was an invitation you didn't want to send. But he felt their stillness as he passed. It was a different kind of stillness from everyone else in the room. Not boredom, not arrogance. Something focused. The way a lens focuses light. Narrow, deliberate, warm. He kept walking. For minutes later, a man he hadn't seen approach appeared at his left shoulder. Mid-30s. Heavy built. A face that was all hard angles and old scars. He didn't take a flute from the tray. He just matched Selim's pace for 3 steps, looked at him sidelong, and said, quietly, like it was barely worth the air. Keep your head down tonight, Omega. Selim didn't react. The man fell back, disappeared into the crowd. Selim kept walking, but inside that chest full of filed away things, a new sensation arrived. Small, unfamiliar. He couldn't identify it yet. It wasn't fear. It was something more like weight. The weight of being paid attention to in a way that was different from all the other attention in the room. He didn't understand it yet. He filed it away. And then the grip came, from behind, sudden and decisive. A hand closing around the collar of his server's shirt and pulling, not enough to choke but enough to stop, enough to swing him half around, enough to make the tray tip dangerous. The alpha who held him was the same one from before. Gold rings. Whiskey breath. Eyes bright with the particular energy of someone who had made a decision and was executing it. You didn't answer me earlier. His voice carried. Nearby conversations stuttered and stalled. Heads turned. I asked you a question. A simple one. He looked at the crowd collecting around them. Playing to it. Can't. Or won't. The crowd was a ring now. Not hostile. Curious. Entertained. This was an event. Something to watch with their champagne while the piano kept playing because of course the piano kept playing. Selim felt the collar tight at his throat, felt the public geometry of the moment, the ring of faces, the bright lights, the held-breath quality of people waiting to see what an Omega with no voice would do when cornered in front of an audience. He looked at the Alpha's face for a long moment, and then he did the one thing no one in that room expected. He reached up, slowly, and removed the hand from his collar. Not aggressively, with the same quiet precision he used to balance a tray. He took the Alpha's wrist, lifted it, and set it aside like it was something that had been placed somewhere it didn't belong. The crowd went still. The piano played on. Selim straightened his shirt, turned, walked away, not fast, not slow, just walked. And somewhere in the room, in the quiet of that stunned moment, something shifted in the eyes of three men by the window. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. He made it to the garden-side corridor before the trembling started. Not visible. Not in his hands or his face. Deep inside, where the body keeps its truth, the trembling that comes after the adrenaline, after the decision, after you have done the brave thing and now your body is catching up to what just happened and sending its invoice. His back was against the wall. The corridor was empty. Through the door behind him, muffled, the reception noise continued. Voices, a burst of laughter, the piano threading through all of it like nothing had been interrupted. Because for them, nothing had. That was the part he had to keep understanding, keep accepting, keep storing in that full place in his chest. For them, what just happened was a moment, a diversion, 30 seconds of entertainment that would blur into the general texture of the evening before they were 3 drinks deeper. For him, it was the shape of his life. He pressed his palms flat against the cool wall behind him, felt the stone, counted the texture of it. The grounding techniques weren't therapy. No one had ever offered him therapy. They were things he had developed the way all survival adaptations develop. Slowly, by necessity, because the alternative was coming apart in the middle of a ballroom. He stayed in the corridor for 90 seconds, then picked up the tray he'd set on the side table, checked his shirt was straight, went back in. The east side of the ballroom was quieter. The main event, toasts, the cutting of the cake, the ceremonial handshake between the 2 family patriarchs, had moved to the center stage. Attention followed it. Selim moved to the edges, kept his routes tight, kept his presence minimal. He was good at this. The invisibility wasn't natural, it was practiced. Years of adjusting his route to avoid the loudest tables. Years of calibrating his presence so that he registered as furniture rather than a person. It was a skill and it had costs the way all skills built on pain have costs. But tonight it was serving him. Until it wasn't. The older Alpha with the silver temples had moved. He was standing now near the south wall, 2 men with him, and Selim's most direct route to the champagne station passed within 10 feet of them. He slowed, considered the alternate route. Longer, past the bar where the gold ring Alpha might still be circling. He did the math. He kept going. Direct, fast, eyes ahead. He made it 8 feet. There he is. Silver temples. Not loud. Not even directed at Selim exactly. At his companions, in the tone of someone pointing out a curiosity. The one I was telling you about. The mute. One of the companions turned to look. Selim didn't stop walking. Does it bother you? The voice rose slightly, aimed now. When people talk about you like you're not there? 4 feet from the champagne station. 3. Because I've been doing it for an hour and you haven't said a word. Which tells me something. A pause. Then, lighter, almost conversational. Either you don't understand us, or you do understand us and you simply don't matter enough to respond. 2 feet. Selim reached the station, set down the tray, picked up the replacement bottles. He did not look at the man. He did not hurry. He completed the exchange with the same careful, unhurried precision he had used every other time, because hurrying would have looked like running and he refused to run. Refused it the way you refuse to give someone the satisfaction of a flinch after they've tried very hard to make you flinch. He turned back toward the floor. And then the hand came again. Different hand this time, not gold rings, not silver temples. A third person he didn't recognize. Younger. Eager. The kind of young that had something to prove in front of an audience of older men. The grip landed on his shoulder from behind and spun him. And this time the tray went with him, and this time the flutes on it slid, and two of them fell, and this time the sound was not a distant accident. It was close and deliberate, and the ring of silence that spread from it was immediate. The young alpha who had spun him wore the exact expression Selim had seen on the gold ring alpha earlier. Bright, lit up. Burning the particular energy of someone who has finally gotten the reaction they were engineering. Except, Selim had not reacted. He stood in the small debris of glass and champagne and looked at the young alpha's face with the same expression he'd worn all night. Still, contained, present without being available. The expression of someone who had gone somewhere the humiliation couldn't quite follow. The young alpha's brightness flickered. He hadn't gotten what he came for. Say something, he said. And this time there was an edge to it. Less performance. More genuine irritation. You mute freak. Say one word. The room around them had coalesced. Not dramatically, there was no shouting, no confrontation. Just the subtle gravitational pull that public scenes create, conversations dropping off, people angling slightly, the collective body language of an audience. Selim looked at him for one more beat. Then he set down what remained on the tray. Placed the tray carefully on the nearest table, reached into his pocket for the small cloth he carried and crouched, without hurry, without drama, and picked up the larger pieces of glass from the floor. The young alpha stared down at him. The brightness had curdled into something uncertain. Did you hear me? Selim stood, placed the glass fragments on the tray. Looked at the young alpha one final time. Then he turned and walked, not toward the service corridor, not toward the champagne station. He walked toward the exit, the main door at the far end of the hall, straight through the center of the room with the particular quality of movement that has made a decision and will not be renegotiated. The conversations around him dimmed as he passed. Not all of them, not dramatically, but there was a wave of it. A gentle, progressive quieting that followed his path through the room, the way ripples follow a stone dropped in water. The piano played on for exactly 3 more bars. Then the pianist missed a note. Just one. Small. But the first one all evening. Selim reached the door, pushed through it. And the cold night air hit his face and his lungs expanded, and he didn't stop walking because if he stopped walking it would become something else, and it could not become something else right now. He walked until he reached the far edge of the estate's outer colonnade. Marble columns, pale stone, the distant sound of the city beyond the high walls. He stopped there, pressed both hands flat on the stone railing, looked out, breathed. He had not cried tonight. He was not crying now. What moved through him was something harder and quieter than crying, the grinding kind of feeling that doesn't have water in it, that just grinds. He stood there for a long time. He didn't notice the doors at the far end of the colonnade open and close. He didn't notice the footsteps. 3 sets, perfectly measured, perfectly quiet. He didn't notice 3 identical silhouettes stop in the shadow of the columns 20 feet behind him and simply remain there, watching, not approaching. Not yet, just watching, because they had watched him all night. Through every moment, through every grip and every laugh and every test. And what they had watched was not what the room had seen. The room had seen a mute Omega who couldn't fight back. They had seen something entirely different. Kaiser spoke first. He always did. He doesn't bend. His voice was low, designed to carry no further than the 2 men standing beside him. They've been at him all night. He hasn't bent once. To his left, Dmitri stood with his arms crossed, eyes still fixed on the pale figure at the railing. He compensates. Every time someone moves on him, he accounts for it before they've finished the action. Watch the way he holds the tray after the second incident. He adjusted his grip, changed the balance point. Theron, on the right, said nothing for a moment. Then, "He's exhausted." The other two looked at him. "Look at his shoulders. He's holding them up deliberately." Theron's voice was the quietest of the three. It always was. "He's been holding them up since the first incident. That takes everything." The three of them stood in the shadow of the colonnade and watched Selim at the railing without moving. They were identical in the way that struck people before anything else. Same height, same build, same dark hair, same bone structure in the jaw and brow. But spend more than a few minutes with all three of them and the differences emerged fast. Kaiser occupied space with the particular authority of someone who had never once been told no and had spent that entire time learning what to do with that. Dmitri was the one you felt before you saw, quiet intelligence that organized a room without calling attention to itself. And Theron watched people the way a doctor reads vitals. Not clinically, with genuine attention to the thing beneath the surface. All three of them had been watching Selim since the tray went down. "He's a server," Kaiser said, not dismissively, as a data point. "He was assigned last minute. Dmitri, the original server for the West section, called out sick this afternoon. They pulled him from the reserve list." A pause. "He's been doing this for 3 years. Same agency. Event circuit. Mostly high-end functions." Theron turned his head slightly. "You looked him up already." "During the second incident." Dmitri said it plainly without apology. "I wanted to know what we were watching." "And Kaiser. Selim Ashby, 23. Born mute. It's neurological, not trauma-based. No pack affiliation. No family on record. He's been working the event circuit since he was 19. A pause that had weight in it. "He's been to 17 functions in this family's network in the last 2 years. We've been at 4 of them." Kaiser turned his head slowly. "We've seen him before. We've been in the same room as him before." Dimitri's distinction was careful. "Whether we saw him is a different question." At the railing, Selim shifted, both hands still flat on the stone. His head dropped slightly, not defeat, recalibration. The kind of drop that meant he was doing something internal. The inventory that people take when the external pressure has passed and the body needs to assess what's still intact. Theron stepped forward 1 pace. "Stopped." "Don't," Kaiser said. "I'm not going to approach him." "You were about to." Theron didn't deny it. He looked at Selim for another moment. "He's alone out here. He's been alone in that room for 6 hours. He's going to file away tonight the way he's filed away every other night, and tomorrow he'll go back and do it again because that's what his life has given him room to do." "That's exactly what we're here to understand," Kaiser said. "Not to interrupt. Understanding doesn't require watching someone be miserable from 20 feet away. That's not what we're doing." Kaiser's voice didn't rise. It never did. "We're watching how he carries it. Because that matters." Dmitri spoke again, quieter now. "The one who grabbed his collar the second time, Jeremy Watts. He's a mid-level affiliate of the Haver faction. He's done this before. Other events. Always Omegas, always in public, always in settings where no one with enough status is paying attention." Kaiser's jaw tightened. A small movement, the only kind he made. "The one who spun him at the end," Dmitri continued. "Marcus Osei, Jr., 20 years old, wants to impress Watts. Tonight was an audition." Theron exhaled. Low, controlled. The breath of someone who is managing something that would prefer to be unmanaged. At the railing, Selim straightened, both hands lifted from the stone. He stood for a moment with them at his sides, fingers loose, and the posture shift was visible even from 20 feet away. Something settling back into place, something being returned to its designated position inside him. The spine aligned. The shoulders took their measured position. The face, which had been briefly and privately something else, went smooth. He was preparing to go back in. Theron watched that happen and felt it land somewhere specific. "He's going to go back in," he said. "Yes," Kaiser said. "After everything tonight, he's going to pick up a tray and go back in." Kaiser said nothing. "That," Theron said quietly, "is not weakness." The silence between the three of them was the kind that held things. The kind that three people share when they have been moving through the same life in close formation and have learned what the other silences mean. Kaiser moved first. One step forward, no more. He stopped in a column of moonlight and looked at the back of Selim's head with an expression that, on anyone else's face, might have been difficult to read. On Kaiser's face it was simply rare, the expression of a man who had decided something. "He needs to know," Kaiser said. "He's not ready to know," Dmitri said. "He doesn't need to understand it. He needs to feel it." Theron looked between his brothers, then back at Selim. The figure at the railing was pulling back from the stone now, turning slightly, about to move. Kaiser stepped back into shadow. So did Dmitri. So did Theron. But not before Kaiser said, quietly, to no one, to everyone, to the night itself, "Not yet." Selim turned, walked back toward the ballroom doors. His path took him along the colonnade, and as he passed the shadow where the three of them stood, perfectly still, perfectly silent, he slowed, just slightly, for barely a second. His head didn't turn, his eyes didn't move, but he slowed, as if something in the air changed. As if some part of him that had been trained by years of danger received a signal it couldn't quite decode, not threat, not safety. Something in between. Something aware. He kept walking. The doors closed behind him. Dmitri said low, "He felt us." "Yes," Theron said. And then Kaiser said the thing none of them were quite ready to say. "Good." Nothing announced it. That was the thing. If you had been standing in the ballroom watching, you would not have seen a moment. There was no event, no confrontation, no visible shift. The music continued. The lights stayed warm. The guests moved through their expensive evening without interruption. But the geography of the room had changed. Selim didn't understand it yet. He was still operating on the internal calculations of survival, route planning, tray balance, proximity management. He had come back through the east corridor and picked up a fresh tray and re-entered the floor, and the first thing he registered was that the young alpha who had spun him, Marcus, was no longer where he'd been. His cluster had moved to the far end of the room, near the bar, and their energy was different. Lower. The brightness had gone out of them. He noted it, filed it, moved on. The next thing was the path. It took him 3 transits of the floor to recognize the pattern. Each time Selim moved through a dense cluster of guests, there was a slight loosening. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a natural-looking shift in bodies that opened a route where there had been crowding before. A woman stepped back to speak to her neighbor. 2 men pivoted. A group reorganized around a conversation. The floor, which had been a tight obstacle course an hour ago, was becoming slightly more navigable. He could not have said why. He could not have named the mechanism. But his body, which processed threat before his mind did, had also learned to process the absence of threat. And it registered this. The randomness had changed shape. What looked like normal crowd movement was too consistent. The loosening happened specifically in his path. Specifically when he was moving. Something was clearing his way. He didn't understand who. He didn't understand how. He filed the sensation in the already full place in his chest and kept moving. The third thing was the tray. He had been working the west side when he turned toward the champagne station and found a full replacement tray already prepared and placed at the exact height and angle he preferred. Not the standard position, not the way the other servers set trays. His exact positioning. He stood in front of it for 3 full seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than he'd stopped for anything all evening. Someone had been watching how he worked. Not just tonight. In detail. In the specific mechanics of how he carried weight and where he set his equipment and what made his job marginally less difficult. His hands were still as he picked up the tray. He moved back to the floor. He was halfway through his next circuit when the child appeared. She was small, 4 years old, maybe 5. A dark-skinned girl in a white dress with a wide sash that had come partially untied, trailing behind her like a flag. She was standing between 2 tables looking in 3 directions at once with the focused alarm of someone who has lost track of a specific adult and is running internal calculations on the problem. Selim saw her the same moment she saw him. She looked at him for 1 second. Then she walked directly to him, placed her small hand on the edge of his tray, not grabbing, just touching, and looked up at his face with the absolute uncomplicated trust that children extend to people whose energy they've already assessed and found acceptable. She said something he couldn't hear over the room noise, but her face was readable. She was looking for someone. He crouched, set the tray carefully on the floor beside him, looked at her face. Really looked the way he looked at everything, with the attention of someone who has no other channel for communication. She repeated herself louder this time. A name. A woman's name. He reached into his front pocket and produced the small notepad he carried. Not unusual for a server, commonly used for orders. He held out the pen and the pad and pointed at the notepad. She understood immediately, the way children do when an alternative is offered clearly. She took the pen in both hands, the serious whole-body grip of a 4-year-old writing, and drew something that was approximately a letter. Then looked up at him. He turned the pad, looked at what she'd drawn. Then he looked out across the room, found the shape she'd described, looked back at her and pointed. Her face went from worried to completely resolved. She handed him back his pen. Then, before he could react, she wrapped both arms around his leg in the brief, fierce, total hug of a child expressing something words couldn't contain fast enough. Then she was gone, running across the floor toward the woman Selim had identified. He remained crouched for a moment, looking at the empty space in front of him. The notepad was still in his hand. He looked at the mark she'd made on it, folded it, put it back in his pocket, stood up, picked up the tray. The warm water quality of the feeling that had moved through him when she hugged his leg, brief, total, entirely uncomplicated, was not something he had a word for. He had never had a word for it. He had simply never received that kind of contact before. The kind that didn't want anything back. The kind that didn't have a cost. He stood on the floor of the ballroom with his tray level and his face neutral and that feeling moving through him like something that didn't know where to go. He was not, at this moment, filing anything away. He was simply standing in it. At the window, Theron watched the entire sequence. He had not moved. He had barely breathed. He had watched Selim crouch, produce the notepad, read what the child drew, identify the woman, and then absorb that hug with the expression of someone receiving something they had not known they were hungry for. Theron's chest did something complicated. He turned to Kaiser. Kaiser was already looking at him. Neither of them spoke. But Dimitri, who had been watching the child run back to her grandmother, said quietly, "She chose him. Children don't choose by accident," Theron said. "No," Kaiser agreed. "They don't." Selim was moving again now, back into his circuit. Tray level, face neutral. But something about him was different. A quality in the set of his shoulders, in the way he moved through the room. Marginally less like someone managing an obstacle course. Marginally more like someone who had just been reminded that they existed. Theron had been the quietest of the 3 all evening. He was the one who measured what others ignored. And what he was measuring now. The cumulative weight of everything he'd watched Selim absorb and carry and refuse to break under, was pushing against something in him that he could not strategically manage. "He doesn't know," Theron said. No, Kaiser said. That we've been watching. No, that his path has been cleared. No, that the people who touched him tonight are going to find the next 3 months professionally inconvenient. A pause. That, Dmitri said. He hasn't processed yet. Theron looked at Selim's back as he moved through the thinned crowd. When he figures out the room has changed. He won't figure it out tonight, Kaiser said. But eventually. Kaiser's voice carried nothing extra. No drama, no warmth, just the quiet certainty of something that has already been decided. And when he does, it won't be confusion that he feels. Theron looked at his brother. Kaiser's eyes didn't leave Selim. It'll be the beginning of something he doesn't have a word for yet. The evening wound toward its end. Guests began to drift. The piano shifted to something slower. Selim worked the final circuit of the night, collecting, clearing, returning trays to the service station with the same systematic precision he'd maintained for 6 hours. He passed the window. 3 figures. Still there. Still watching. This time he didn't just slow. This time he turned his head. Just slightly. Just enough. His eyes moved to the edge of the window bank and found nothing. Empty space. The columns where 3 men had been standing perfectly still for most of the evening. They were gone. He stood for one breath looking at the empty space. Then he turned back and kept moving. And in the service corridor, 30 feet and 1 wall away, 3 men stood in the shadow and said nothing at all. Because they didn't need to. What had just happened was already a question. And questions had a way of not letting go. The envelope was on his locker when he arrived the next morning. No name on the front. No return address. Just a clean white rectangle sitting on top of his jacket like it had always been there. Like someone had placed it with exactly enough confidence to not need an explanation. Selim stood in the doorway of the staff room for 3 full seconds. Then he walked in, picked it up, opened it. Inside was a single card. Heavy stock, no letterhead. For words in clean, precise type. You are not invisible. That was all. He stood with the card in his hands and read it twice. Then a 3rd time. Not because the words were complicated. Because his body needed a moment to decide what to do with them. The full place in his chest, the one that had been holding things for years, did something it hadn't done in a long time. It shifted. Not opened. Not released. Just shifted. Like something inside rearranged to make room. He put the card in his pocket. Changed into his uniform. Went to work. The function that day was a midday luncheon. Smaller than the wedding. 40 guests, private dining room. The kind of event where the staff becomes furniture within the first 10 minutes and stays that way. Selim knew this format. He was good at disappearing into it. Except he couldn't quite disappear today. The card kept pulling at the edge of his attention the way a splinter pulls. Not enough to stop you. Enough to remind you it's there. You are not invisible. He had no context for it. He had no framework for receiving that sentence from an unknown source in a world that had spent 23 years constructing an elaborate argument for the exact opposite position. The sentence didn't fit. It sat in his pocket like a foreign object, and his mind kept returning to it with the same careful, circling attention he gave to anything that didn't make sense yet. He was refilling water glasses at the far end of the table when he first noticed the man. Late 40s. Seated 2 chairs from the end. Well-dressed but not loudly so. The kind of clothes that communicated money without announcing it. He had been in conversation for most of the service, leaning toward the woman beside him, engaged and unhurried. Nothing remarkable, except that twice in the 40 minutes since the luncheon began, Selim had caught the man looking at him. Not the way the alphas last night had looked at him. Not with assessment or appetite or the particular brightness of someone identifying a target. This was different. This was the look of someone completing a task. The third time it happened, the man's eyes didn't slide away when Selim noticed. They stayed for one measured beat. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, produced a business card, and placed it face down on the table directly beside Selim's current position. Then he turned back to his conversation. Selim looked at the card on the table. He looked at the man's profile. He picked up the card, turned it over. No company name, no title, just a number and 2 words below it. Call when ready. The handwriting matched the card from his locker. Pause on that. He stood at the end of the table with both cards now, the one from the morning, the one from the luncheon, held between his fingers, and for the first time all day his hands weren't entirely steady. Not fear. Something adjacent to fear but inverted. Something that felt distantly and dangerously like being found. He didn't call that day. He didn't call the next day either. He went home to the studio apartment that cost more of his income than anything should and sat at the small table by the window and put both cards flat on the surface and looked at them for a long time. There were explanations. Plenty of them. None of them comfortable. People with resources and access who wanted something from Mute Omegas working the event circuit were not, in his experience, operating from charitable motives. He had learned that early. He had paid for learning it. But the sentence kept returning. You are not invisible. He woke up at 3 a.m. with it still in his head and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the wedding. About the tray. About the gold rings and the silver temples and the young alpha named Marcus who had spun him and gotten nothing back for it. About the way the room had loosened around him in the second half of the evening. About the tray that had been set at exactly his height and angle. About the child. About the empty space in the colonnade where 3 figures had been and then weren't. He sat up. He didn't have answers. But he had something he hadn't had yesterday. A shape. Something was forming at the edge of what he could see. Not clear yet. Not named. But shaped. He lay back down. In the morning he picked up the card and looked at the number for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in years. He reached for his phone. He didn't dial. But he held the phone in his hand with the number visible and sat there, and that was more than he'd done in a very long time. In an office across the city, Dmitri received a quiet notification on his phone. He read it. Said nothing. Then he sent a single message to his brothers. He picked up the phone. Kaiser read it. Set his own phone down. Looked at the wall for a moment. Then, quietly, almost to himself, good. Theron read it last. He read it twice. And then, for the first time since the wedding, he allowed himself something that hadn't been safe to feel yet. Something close to relief. The little girl's name was Imani. Selim found this out 11 days after the wedding. Not from any of the 3 men he still hadn't spoken to, but from Imani herself. She found him. He was working a small private gallery opening, the kind of event that was 90% standing around and 10% art. The crowd was smaller than usual, quieter, the kind of gathering that felt like it had been designed for conversation rather than performance. He was moving along the far wall with a tray of sparkling water when he felt the tug on the back of his jacket. He turned. She was standing there in a yellow dress this time. The same child from the wedding, same wide sash, same absolute uncomplicated certainty in her eyes. She had clearly been brought here by adults who were somewhere else in the gallery. She had clearly identified Selim as the most relevant person in the room. She pointed at him, then pointed at herself. Then held up both hands, fingers splayed, and waited. He understood, somehow, that she was asking if he remembered her. He nodded. Her face went entirely satisfied. She reached into the small bag hanging from her shoulder, the kind children carry when they want to feel formal, and produced a folded piece of paper. She held it up. He crouched, set down the tray, took the paper, unfolded it. It was a drawing, crayon, a figure with silverish hair, approximated with a gray crayon pressed hard into the page. holding a tray. Beside the figure, a smaller shape that was clearly meant to be her. Both figures had dots for eyes and lines for smiles that curved in the specific hopeful way that children draw mouths when they want the person in the picture to be happy. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he looked at her. She was watching him with the patient attention of someone waiting for a grade. He reached into his pocket, found the notepad, drew a quick, clean image, the two of them same composition as her drawing, but with slightly more detail. He handed it back. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. Then she pointed at his drawing and then at hers and held them up side by side with the specific pride of someone completing a match set. He felt that warm water thing again, moving through his chest, quiet and total and without a cost attached to it. She stayed near him for 20 minutes. Not clinging. She was too purposeful for clinging. She orbited, checked in, wandered to look at a piece of art, came back, checked in again, like she had assigned herself a responsibility and was taking it seriously. At one point a woman appeared, mid-50s, elegant, reading glasses pushed up into her natural hair, and found Amani standing next to Selim at the water station. The woman looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Then she said, "She's been talking about you since the wedding." He held very still. "She told everyone at the table about the man with the notepad who found me." She paused. "She means herself. She talks in the third person when something matters." She looked at Imani, then back at Selim. "My name is Celestine Okafor. I'm her grandmother." She studied him with the frank appraisal of someone who had lived long enough to not waste time on imprecision. "She's an excellent judge of character. I stopped second-guessing her when she was 2. Selim didn't have a response for that. He never had a verbal response for anything. But Celestine Okafor looked at his face and seemed to find what she was looking for anyway. "You're good with her," she said. He didn't know what to do with that sentence. He filed it with the other ones, "You are not invisible, call when ready," in the accumulating collection of things that didn't fit the shape of his life as he had understood it. Imani tugged on her grandmother's sleeve and said something fast. Then she looked at Selim, then at her grandmother, then back at Selim, then held up her drawing again. "She wants to know if you'll be at the next one," Celestine said. "There's a family dinner next month. My nephew hosts them. She's asking if you work those." He didn't know what family she meant. He didn't know which nephew. He wrote on the notepad, "I take what I'm assigned." Celestine read it. Then she smiled. Small, precise. The smile of someone who knows more than they are saying and finds the gap between that and what you know mildly entertaining. "Of course," she said. "We'll see then." Imani waved at him when they left. Both hands. Total commitment. He stood in the gallery with his tray and watched her go. Across the room, visible only if you were looking, and only if you knew what to look for, a figure stood near the sculpture installation with a glass he hadn't touched all evening. Theron. He had arrived 30 minutes after Selim. He had stationed himself near the east wall, and he had watched the entire exchange. The drawing, the notepad, the grandmother, the wave, with the expression of someone receiving confirmation of something they had hoped for but hadn't allowed themselves to count on. He pulled out his phone, sent a message to his brothers. She found him again. "Grandmother is Celestine." A pause. Then Dimitri. "Celestine Okafor. She's clean. Old family money, no faction ties. She's been attending our family functions socially for 6 years." Another pause. Then Kaiser, last. "The child keeps choosing him." Theron put his phone away, looked across the room at Selim, who was now back on his circuit, tray level, face neutral. But something about him was different from the wedding. Something in the line of his shoulders. The way he moved. He was still carrying everything. But the way he carried it had changed. Slightly. Barely. Enough. Children see what adults ignore, Theron thought. Trust is a more powerful bond than fear. He looked at his own untouched glass. then set it down, and decided it was nearly time. Jeremy Watts lost 3 contracts in 8 days. He didn't connect them at first. The first one, a security consulting agreement with a mid-level hospitality group, ended with a brief email citing strategic restructuring. He had cursed at his phone and moved on. These things happened. The second one was a distribution deal he'd been building for 4 months. The call came from a lawyer he'd never spoken to before, representing interests he didn't recognize, using language that was technically polite and practically irreversible. He had spent 2 hours on the phone trying to understand what had shifted. Nobody told him. The third one arrived as a hand-delivered letter. Physical paper. No email trail. The kind of communication that certain people still used because they understood that paper leaves a different kind of record than digital, or sometimes no record at all. The letter thanked him for his interest and informed him that his services would no longer be required, effective immediately, with a settlement figure that was generous enough to communicate something without saying it. It communicated, "Don't ask questions." By the time Marcus Osei received his own notice, not a letter, not a call, but a visit from 2 men in good suits who smiled pleasantly and explained that his application to the Alpha Development Program had been reviewed and declined, and that the reviewing committee suggested he consider opportunities in a different city. He and Watts were already in a conversation about what was happening. Neither of them could name it. They had made enemies before. That was the nature of the circles they moved in. But enemies usually announced themselves. There was usually a confrontation, a warning, a specific grievance tied to a specific moment. This had no face. It had no name attached. It was simply the world, rearranging. Quietly, efficiently, without drama. This is important. Understand what that means. Real power doesn't need noise. It doesn't need confrontation. It doesn't need to explain itself or justify its movements or give you the dignity of knowing who's responsible. It simply adjusts the landscape, closes the doors, and leaves you standing in a room that's suddenly smaller than it was yesterday, with no clear understanding of how that happened. Watts would spend 6 weeks trying to reconstruct the sequence before abandoning the effort. There was nothing to reconstruct. There were no meetings, no memos, no paper trails that led anywhere useful. The decisions had been made in the kind of spaces where decisions like that get made. Quietly, with certainty, by people who didn't need to announce what they were doing because they never had before. Selim knew none of this. He was 43 days out from the wedding, working a corporate reception at a hotel downtown, and what he knew about his life was this. It was slightly, inexplicably, less difficult than it had been 6 weeks ago. He couldn't have mapped the specific changes. They were too distributed, too individual. A supervisor at the agency who had always assigned him the worst sections had been transferred to a different department. The parking situation at the service entrance of the hotel had been reorganized so that the section he used wasn't the exposed, badly lit stretch it had been for 2 years. 3 alphas who regularly attended the event circuit, 3 he could have identified by name, or would have identified by their cologne and the particular sound of their voices, had simply stopped appearing. He noticed these things the way he noticed all things, carefully, without interpretation yet, just collecting. The corporate reception was easy work. Low social tension. The guests were business people, not faction leadership. The event had the particular energy of people who were here professionally rather than personally, which meant the power games ran along different and usually less physical lines. Selim had worked half his circuit when he saw the man from the luncheon, the one who had left the card. He was standing near the bar, not drinking, in conversation with a second man Selim hadn't seen before. Both of them in dark suits. Both of them carrying the specific quality of stillness that Selim had started to recognize. The kind that didn't come from being at rest but from choosing deliberately to hold the energy in. The luncheon man, he still didn't have a name for him, glanced at Selim as he passed. Just a glance. Nothing performed. But when Selim reached the far end of his circuit and turned back, the man was standing 3 feet to his left and his companion was gone. Selim Ashby. His voice was even, low. Not a question. Selim stopped. My name is Reginald Cross. I work for 3 people you haven't been formally introduced to yet. He paused. Let that sit. You found the cards. Selim looked at him. You haven't called. Another pause. That's fine. Some people need more time to trust the shape of something before they engage with it. Reginald Cross looked at him with the frank, uncomplicated gaze of someone who was not going to perform this conversation. I'm not here to pressure you. I'm here because my employers asked me to tell you something directly, and they wanted it said by a person rather than sent on paper. Selim waited. You have been under protection since the night of the Hale Reeves wedding reception. Reginald Cross said it the way you say something that is simply true. Not surveillance. Protection. The distinction matters, and they wanted you to understand it. The tray in Selim's hands was perfectly level. The people who made your work difficult in the last 2 months are no longer in positions to do that. That process is complete. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a 3rd card. Same heavy stock. Same clean type. This one had an address on it and a time. Tomorrow evening. This is an invitation, not a summons. There's a difference between those two. He held out the card. Selim took it. You don't have to come, Reginald said. But they would like you to know everything that's happened in the last 6 weeks. They want you to know it wasn't accidental. He stepped back, gave the space back. The rest is yours to decide. He walked away without looking back. Selim stood in the middle of the corporate reception with a tray in one hand and a card in the other. Around him, 40 business people moved through their efficient evening, completely unaware that anything had just happened. He looked at the address on the card. Then he looked at the room. Then back at the card. And for the first time in 43 days, since the card on his locker, since the child's hug, since the colonnade and the 3 empty spaces where something had been watching him, the shape he'd been trying to see finally came into focus. Not completely, not in full detail, but enough that he understood it was real. Something had been moving around him, not against him. For him, he put the card in his pocket, finished his shift, walked home, and this time, when he sat at the small table by the window, he didn't put the card flat on the surface and stare at it. He propped it against the lamp where he could see it, and he didn't look away. He showed up. That was the thing nobody who knew Selim Ashby's life would have expected. That after everything, after 23 years of learning that engaging with power was how you got hurt, that attention from alphas had a cost, that walking towards something unfamiliar was how you ended up in a worse position than the one you started in, he showed up anyway. He stood outside the address for 7 minutes. It was not a corporate building, not a hotel. It was a private residence, or what passed for one at this level. A townhouse in a quiet block, the kind of block where the buildings didn't announce themselves because they didn't need to. Iron gate, stone steps, warm light in the windows. 7 minutes. Then he walked up the steps and pressed the bell. Reginald Cross opened the door. He said nothing. He simply stepped back and held the door, and Selim walked in. The interior was the kind of quiet that costs money. Not empty, not cold, just deeply, deliberately calm. No one in the entrance hall. No crowd. Reginald led him down a corridor that was all dark wood and low light and opened a door at the end. The room beyond it had 3 men in it. Selim stopped in the doorway. He knew them. Not by name. Not yet. By the quality of their stillness. By the identical line of their shoulders, the identical structure of their faces, the way they occupied space with the particular authority of people who had never had to fight for room. He had seen them at the wedding. At the window, he had felt them in the colonnade. Kaiser stood near the fireplace, arms at his sides, dark eyes on Selim with an expression that held nothing performative. No warmth manufactured for the occasion, no effort to seem less than what he was. Just presence. Dmitri was seated, a folder closed on the table in front of him. He looked at Selim with the calm attention of someone who had already done their preparation and was now simply here. Theron was the one closest to the door. He was also the first to speak. "You came," he said, like it was the one thing he'd needed to confirm. Selim looked at him, then at the other two, then back at Theron. He reached into his pocket, took out his notepad, held up the pen. "Why me?" Not a question. A demand for accuracy. Kaiser moved first, one step away from the fireplace. He looked at the notepad and then at Selim's face with the kind of directness that didn't give you anywhere to hide from it. "Because we watched you absorb things that would have broken most people. And you didn't break." Selim's pen was still in his hand. "Because," Dmitri said from his chair, "you chose dignity when it would have been easier to choose anything else. And that kind of choice is rare. In any room, at any level." Theron looked at him steadily. "Because Imani trusted you before any of us had decided anything. And we've learned to take that seriously." Selim looked at the three of them. The full place in his chest was doing something he didn't have a name for. Not opening, it wasn't that clean. More like something under pressure that had been pressing against a wall for a very long time, and the wall had just moved. He wrote on the notepad, turned it. "What do you want from me?" Kaiser answered without hesitation. "Nothing you don't choose to give." He held Selim's eyes when he said it. Didn't look away. Didn't add anything to soften it or make it more palatable. Just said it, flat and certain, the way he said everything. Selim looked at him for a long time. Then he wrote again. Slower this time. "Reginald said protection. I didn't ask for that." "No," Kaiser said. "You didn't. We made that decision. Without asking me." "Yes." A pause. The three of them exchanged something. Not a look exactly, more like a shared breath, a small moment of deciding how to say the true thing accurately. Theron said it. "Because you were being harmed in spaces we had access to. And doing nothing was a choice too." He paused. "We chose not to do nothing." Selim lowered the notepad. He stood in the middle of that room, this quiet, expensive room with its dark wood and its low firelight, and he stood in the silence of three men who were not trying to fill it, who were simply letting him be where he was and process what he needed to process, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not safe. He wasn't there yet, but adjacent to it, the proximity of it. Finally he wrote, "I don't understand what this is." Dmitri answered that one. "That's fair. You don't have to understand it yet." A pause. "We're asking for time. That's all. Time to show you what this is rather than tell you." Kaiser took one more step. He was closer now, close enough that Selim could have stepped back if he'd wanted to. He didn't. Kaiser looked at him with that direct, no-performance gaze and said the sentence quietly. The one that had been building since the wedding, since the colonnade, since 43 days of watching and clearing paths and arranging the world into a slightly less hostile shape. "You're ours." He let it land. Not as a possession, not as a claim, as a declaration of what we've already decided and what we're asking you to consider deciding too. The room was completely quiet. Selim looked at Kaiser for a long moment, then at Dmitri, then at Theron, and then he did something none of them anticipated. He sat down, not because he was overwhelmed, not because his legs gave out. He sat down with the same deliberate, measured quality he did everything, like a man who has made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion and is now taking up space accordingly. He put the notepad on the table, uncapped the pen, and waited, like he was ready to begin a conversation. From the doorway, Reginald Cross allowed himself exactly one small exhale, then pulled the door almost closed, and left them to it. From the hall a sound reached him, small, faint, the sound of a pen moving across paper. He listened to it for a moment, then walked away smiling. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city. Selim learned this on the drive out, sitting in the back of a car that was quieter than any car he'd ever been in, watching the city fall away behind him and the trees close in and the road narrow into something that felt less like a route and more like a passage. He wasn't frightened. That was the thing he kept checking, the way you press a bruise to see if it still hurts. He kept reaching for the fear that should have been there, the thing that said this is how people like you end up worse off, and finding it quieter than it had ever been. Not gone. Not entirely. But manageable. Placed. The way you learn to carry something that isn't comfortable but isn't breaking you either. The estate appeared around a curve in the road. Stone facade. Old trees along the drive. So old their branches met overhead and made a tunnel of light and shade. A gate that opened before the car reached it. Someone watching, someone anticipating. The grounds were not manicured in the aggressive way that announced wealth. They were tended in the way that announced permanence. This had been here for a long time. Planned to stay. The car stopped. Theron was the one who opened the door. Not a staff member. Not Reginald. Theron, in a dark sweater now instead of a suit, looking slightly more like a person and slightly less like an authority structure. He held the door and said nothing, which was the thing Selim had noticed about all three of them. They had learned, already, not to fill his silence with words that weren't necessary. He got out. He stood on the stone drive and looked at the house and breathed in the air, which was different out here. Cooler. Cleaner. Like the city had been a pressure he'd been carrying without knowing it, and setting it down felt like this. Like a slow exhale that kept going. Imani ran out the front door. She ran the way 4-year-olds run, completely with no reserve, across the stone drive in socks, which was clearly not what any adult in the house had planned, and she ran directly to Selim and wrapped both arms around his waist with total, unhesitating commitment. He put his hand on the top of her head. Just his hand. Gentle. Still. She tipped her head back and looked up at him with the pure satisfaction of someone whose plan has worked out perfectly. Behind her, Celestine Okafor appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who had not been fast enough to prevent the sock situation and had made a certain peace with that. "She knew you were coming before we told her," Celestine said. "I don't know how." Selim looked down at Imani. She was still looking up at him. He reached into his pocket, found the notepad, drew a quick figure, him, the house behind them, showed it to her. She studied it with great seriousness. Then she took the pen from him and added something to the drawing. Gave it back. She had drawn 2 more figures, slightly larger, standing on either side. He looked at the drawing, then up at the doorway where Kaiser had appeared, and Dimitri just behind him. He stood on the stone drive holding a crayon drawing, and the thing that moved through him then was not warm water and not the grinding quiet of stored pain. It was something new. Something that didn't have a shelf in the full place in his chest because it had never needed to be stored. Because it wasn't something to survive. It was something to stand in. The weeks that followed didn't move fast. That was important. That was, Selim would understand later, one of the things that made it real. They didn't rush him. They didn't explain himself to him or hand him a new life fully assembled and expect him to inhabit it immediately. They gave him a room. His own key, the kind of privacy that said this is yours, not ours. And they let him come and go on his own terms, and they let the time do what time does when it's allowed to work honestly. Dimitri was the one who showed him the estate in full on the 3rd day. Not a tour, a walk. Unhurried. Dimitri explaining things about the property not because Selim needed a real estate briefing but because it was conversation, the kind that didn't require Selim to produce words in return but gave him something to follow. He learned the history of the grounds. The old gate. The reason the East Garden had been left deliberately wild. He wrote questions on the notepad and Dimitri answered them as if the questions were spoken aloud, which was the thing Selim noticed. None of them ever paused between his written words and their response. No hesitation that communicated adjustment. No performance of accommodating his silence. They had simply calibrated. Without announcement. Without asking for recognition for doing so. Kaiser was harder. Not cold, never cold. Selim revised that assessment quickly. But Kaiser moved through space with the weight of someone who carried the kind of responsibility that didn't turn off. And that weight was always present even when he was standing in the kitchen at 7 in the morning with a coffee he hadn't touched yet. Selim watched him for 2 weeks before he understood something. Kaiser was the most careful of the three. Not cautious, careful. In the specific way that people are careful with things they do not want to damage. He was being careful with Selim. The understanding of that arrived slowly. And when it arrived with weight. Theron was the easiest to be near. Not because he required less, he was possibly the most perceptive of the three, which Selim clocked within the first few days. But because Theron's attention didn't press. Simply held. Like a hand on your back that you could lean into or not. Present either way. Selim leaned into it. Gradually. The way you lean into something you're not sure will hold until it does. Imani came twice a week. Celestine brought her and stayed for coffee and treated the whole arrangement with the brisk, unceremonious acceptance of someone who had seen enough of the world to not waste energy being surprised when it occasionally did something right. On her 6th visit, Imani arrived with a book. She sat beside Selim on the long bench in the East Garden, the wild one, the deliberately untended one, and opened it and began explaining the pictures to him with the focused authority of someone conducting a very important briefing. He listened. He always listened. And after a while Kaiser came out and sat on the other end of the bench. And Dmitri came and stood nearby with his hands in his pockets. And Theron sat in the grass because he was the only one of the three comfortable enough with informality to do that. And Imani kept talking. And the afternoon light came through the old trees. And Selim sat in the middle of it, in the middle of something he didn't have a word for yet, something he was still calibrating, still testing the weight of, and looked at the drawing she'd given him that first day, the one she'd added to, for figures, her, him, and the 2 larger shapes she'd placed on either side. Except he looked at it now and he understood she had drawn 3, not 2. 3 larger figures, one slightly behind, which was where Dmitri was standing right now. Standing just like that. He looked up at Dmitri. Dmitri looked back at him. Said nothing. Just a slight shift in his expression. Recognition, warmth, nothing performed. Selim looked back at the drawing. He had been learning something these weeks. Not all at once. Not in a revelation. In the slow, accretive way that real things are learned, not delivered, not handed over, but built piece by piece, in the space between moments. He was learning that the place in his chest, the full one, the one he'd been filling for 23 years, had room he hadn't known about, not because it had emptied, but because it had expanded. He was learning that silence didn't mean the same thing in every room. In some rooms it meant you were not worth hearing. In this room, it just meant it was quiet. That night, after Imani had gone and Celestine had given him a look on her way out the door that communicated something warm and private and completely her own, Selim sat at the desk in his room and opened the notepad. He wrote slowly, deliberately, the way he did when he was saying something he meant. He wrote 2 words, I'm staying. He tore it out, folded it, walked down the hall, slipped it under Kaiser's door, walked back to his room, lay down. And this time when the morning came, the new kind of morning, the one that had started happening in this house, the one without the grinding, he didn't reach for the fear. He just let it come. Whatever came next, he was staying. And whatever this was, this quiet, deliberate, impossible thing being built one moment at a time, it was only beginning. He knew that now. And for the first time in 23 years. That didn't scare him. What hurt most wasn't where he started. It was how long everyone expected him to stay there. And what changed everything. Not a fight. Not a speech. Not a dramatic rescue. A child who ran across a stone drive in her socks. A man who chose, finally, to sit down. and 3 kings who had already decided, quietly, irreversibly, that this was where he belonged. If this story moved you, if something in Selim's journey felt familiar, leave a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you. Your words matter here. This channel is built for stories like this one. Quiet power, unexpected belonging, and the moments that change everything without announcing themselves. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. There are more stories on this channel that were made for exactly the person you are, the one who kept watching, who didn't look away, who recognized something true in the silence. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for a person is show them they are not invisible.